Okay. Welcome. Glad to have you both today. Before we begin talking about issues affecting the transgender community here in Fresno, what I would love is if you could just maybe introduce yourselves to our viewers. Tell us a little bit about your background with this topic, and also maybe a little bit about why you specifically wanted to share your experiences and insights with us today.
My name is Amanda Watson. I'm a 50-year-old woman of transgender experience. I feel like this topic is really important because when I came out 20 years ago, when I officially understood what I was, there was no role models or guidance, and so I think a presence is important, and it's also important to preserve our history.
I am Zoyer. I am a 30-year-old man of transgender origin. I also identify as gender fluid. I identify as a gender fluid transgender man. My background with this topic, aside from identifying with this group myself, has been with a community benefit organization named Transemotion, and I have served with the organization for about 10 years as the chair, on and off. I would like to discuss this topic because I feel it's important to understand transgender issues in the context of a larger movement and understand that we do have a history, we have a culture, and we have a movement here today, and that movement will have a future. And so maybe in the future I will be sitting with someone much younger and discussing these things around transgender issues.
Right. So Amanda, you had mentioned a little bit, you kind of touched on it in your introduction, about how things were when you first openly identified as transgender. And so I wanted to hear just maybe a little bit more about what circumstances you encountered, what that initial experience was, say 20 years ago, that might be different from somebody now, what they would go through.
Well, I mean, really, when I first identified, I was probably 4 or 5, but I didn't have a word for it. I was just different. And there was a lot of bullying and harassment, and a lot of bad things happened to me that made me try to hide all of that. And I struggled for a long time. And then finally, I started meeting people that were transgender. And this word all of a sudden came about called transgender or transsexual. And I got a lot of flack actually from the lesbian and gay community because they just felt like, well, you're just a drag queen, or you're just a really flamboyant gay man. You just need to embrace yourself. And it was really hard struggling against that and trying to deal with the potential loss of family. So I dealt with it. I also worked in a mental health facility, and at this time, transgender diagnosis was considered mental illness. So I was very fearful I'd lose my job, but I was very lucky and kept my job, kept all of my family. We have some issues there, but it's overall, we're good together.
For me, when I first openly identified as transgender, it was within a very conservative school district. And I encountered a lot of bullying and harassment on a regular basis, a lot of name calling, and a lot of negligence on the part of staff and faculty. It just seemed like nobody wanted to talk about it, nobody wanted to address it. I complained about the bullying and harassment to school administration, and they did respond, as we had a zero tolerance policy, but they didn't respond sensitively. And I think that they just were operating off of a severe, grave lack of education. And on one occasion, one of the school counselors told me, if you don't want to be made fun of, don't tell anybody. And I remember that resonated with me because this particular person was also from a minority group. And so I felt further isolated in that way. There were some positive experiences, but those happened much later as I aged and started attending college. I came across a support system in the form of a student LGBT organization, and I came to find that if I were to transition, or as I transition, things only improved for the most part instead of stayed negative. And although many people did not understand and there were a lot of questions, they tried to understand, because I think that they, overall, those who knew me saw the individual rather than the demographic group that I belonged to. And so I have seen in my involvement this community receiving more and more positive treatment by authority figures, politicians. By and large, we have received more visibility over the years. So I have watched this evolution. Even though I'm still young, I have seen a lot of change since I came out 17 years ago as a transgender individual. I think that we will continue to improve in our efforts politically as well as socially. I see more awareness in the fields of social work and with communities of helping professionals. It seems like there's just more awareness that we exist. I would see the next step as creating more viable resources for our community.
Now, when you say viable resources, what kinds of things do you feel, because I know that there certainly are organizations like Trans Emotion and gay community centers that also cater to transgender individuals, but what kinds of resources are missing? What kinds of things do you feel would be beneficial to have within the community available to people who may be isolated or may, you know?
One positive experience I have that kind of answers that is when I went on behalf of Trans Emotion with another board member to educate 55 psychologists out of the school district that I went to. And I saw my school principal there, and that was very rewarding for me, my elementary school principal. And so after all these years, I'm seeing him again. He didn't know it was me, but I told him later. I would like to see more instances like that where we are invited to come and educate staff and school psychologists and other people that have authority with the students. I like to be invited to more agencies to do this kind of education. There are disparities that need to be addressed in the medical field and the clinical field. I'd like to see more access to healthcare, to quality healthcare, because for one, it's very difficult for us to access healthcare in the first place, and then once we do, the bedside manner of the practitioner or helping professional is less than sensitive. And so those are areas, just some areas that I'd like to see fixed. I'd like to see less resistance from insurance companies to cover basic medical needs.
Do you have anything to add there?
I'm piggybacking off of what Zoyer is talking about. Access to medical care, I think, at least in the Central Valley, is one of the hugest problems that the transgender community faces, especially like in the youth. There's a need to be very specialized and go through processes, and so someone who's not 18 or above has to go to LA or San Francisco for this care. And, you know, while we can't disclose individual names, we know of transgender children that are here that are having, their families are having to go this great distance. Additionally, getting on hormones is challenging here. Within the hospitals themselves, there becomes a struggle of what do we call you, what do we treat you, and there just needs to be much more education from within the walls of the medical community, I think.
Does this seem to be an issue, kind of, I guess, like the lack of access, does that seem to be more endemic to the Central Valley, or is that kind of more of a widespread, I realize that it to some extent would be widespread, but does it seem to be even worse access here?
I think in rural areas is the best way to say it. So in rural areas of California and the rest of the country, it's much more difficult to access care. And while Fresno is growing as a very large city lately, we're still very small. And no offense to the area, but we still tend to be small-minded. And we haven't grown as a community. We're becoming like a metropolitan environment, but we haven't grown to a metropolitan attitude. I think some of it is it's hard for the Valley to get quality physicians. Who wants to live in Fresno? It's hot here, I can go to LA or San Francisco and get paid twice as much, or New York or Chicago or those big cities.
So based on your experiences, do you feel, or based on the changes that you've seen in society with regard to treatment of transgender people, do you feel like things are changing for the better in any, at least small ways, kind of more of the same, or do you feel that things are getting worse in some ways?
For me, I think there's more awareness, but it's kind of funny because it was about a year ago, Laverne Cox graced the cover of Time magazine, and it was the transgender tipping point. But we really haven't tipped anywhere since that period. And my political views will come out right now, but with the current administration, I feel like there's a backwards movement. And there are very negative things against LGBT in general across the nation coming forward. And so I think it's a point of, we also have a lot of fighting to do right now.
For me, I think the biggest shift over the years that I can see is in terms of the conversation. Conversations now centered more on transgender experiences than they did in the past. And so even though there are still disparities, there's probably a little less than in Amanda's time or when she was my age. But the disparities are still there, though they're being talked about more. And so that is where I see the biggest shift is people willing to have these conversations, willing to advocate for us, willing to be visible to press and media as advocates for our cause. I'm seeing more individuals that are transgender like myself willing to be a visible presence in support of our community and detail their own experiences for education.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming and talking to us today. We hope to hear more from you in the future. I feel that this conversation was much too short. That's just a personal feeling, but I'm sure others would agree with me. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.